Did boy? Teenage girls where they're dating like teenage girls, like sure, misogynist, they kind of feel like this. Okay, yeah, so. And what David.
That was your call. I'm going to bring you up. All right, everybody, we're going to quiet down. Thank you for that. Welcome. It's basically my whole class. Okay, so here we are, another Writer Speak Wednesday. I want to thank you all for coming, even though if you're in the class, you're supposed to be here. We are welcoming the wonderful Kimberly King Parsons, who is the author of the national best-selling novel, We Were the Universe, #2 on Time Magazine's Best Books of 2024, and a Dakota Johnson Book Club pick the New York Times calls a profound, gutsy tale of grief's dismantling power. Parsons' debut collection, Black Light, was longlisted for the National Book Award and the Story Prize. And then there's a whole lot of other wonderful things yeah, exactly. But then we're going to say that she lives with her partner and children in Portland, Oregon, and teaches fiction in the MFA Writing Program at Pacific University. Let's please welcome Kimberly King Parsons.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here. I brought my very tall 13-year-old who's in the front row. And we're really excited. He was born here in New York, but hasn't been back since he was 5, so he's excited. I am going to read, so I've been reading from my novel all year, and it's been a lot, but also my child is in the room, which if you've read my novel, it's sort of relentlessly horny. Anyway, so I'm going to read instead from Black Light. Also, I was just talking to Robert about how I've sort of been returning to writing short stories recently, which I love, and I love reading them. And I really, truly value compression above almost anything in fiction. And I am so happy to be working in that medium again. And so I wanted to read just a little bit from Foxes from Black Light. So here we go. What's worth happening happens in deep woods, or so my daughter tells me. Her plot lines. In the deep woods, someone is chasing, someone else is getting hacked. Hatchets are lifted, brought down, down, down. Men stutter blood onto snow. A cast of animals, some local, some outlandish, show up to feast on the bits. The bitty bits, she'll say, the tasty remainderings. Good luck diverting her. Good luck correcting or getting a word in once she gets going. It's gruesome, but this type of storytelling, I've been assured, is perfectly normal among children her age. I have a fat stack of books concerned with the inner lives of little girls. I have glossy pamphlets, full-color articles I've taken from waiting rooms. Her stories may be distasteful, but my daughter is happiest describing dark, spattered worlds. Routine is what's important. All the experts agree. Stability. So tonight is the same. Woods it is, I say, when she takes me by the wrist. I'm the first to admit it. I tune her out. I know there are foxes in her stories. I know there are men. She misses the dogs, maybe. She misses her father. She's an excitable kid, prone to rushed speech. Truthfully, she spits. I'm told this mess is evidence of a rich mind. Doctors say it, teachers. My girl has strands of dazzling beads hidden in that throat. She pulls them up from somewhere rich, way in the back. The tent she's fashioned is small and drab, a sagging thing posted by a pair of bar stools. Soiled, pulled straight from our beds, these drooping sheets are my daughter and myself layered, fitted and flat. She scurries inside, whistles for me. I bunch up and crawl through, hem in hand, hose flashing, pumps kicked off. The air inside is damp, trapped and sharp from her socked feet. My cheap and not cheap perfumes mix and float. I'm taking too long to settle. My daughter's big, wet eyes are over there in the dark where I can't see them, rolling at me while I struggle. My friction drags dust and old fur up from the carpet. I've been meaning to vacuum, but the machine is in the upstairs closet, heavy with a full bag, a whole skein of orange yarn caught around one of the bristles. My daughter sighs. Patience is a muscle, I remind her. Hers is puny, a weak slick of lavender. My knees don't bend how they used to. My head is doming the roof. Her flashlight clicks on, catches a universe of grit and leftover dog. There's Bit-Bit and Rowdy and Poco turning in the air, specks of my daughter and me, of my fool ex-husband, our old family, filthy and granular. Ready, she says. Deep in the woods, the night is running. From whom? I ask my daughter. From Let Me Tell It, she says. She's not going to like it, but I've forgotten something crucial, an important part of our routine. Half a second, I say. I reverse scoot, wreck against a bar stool, threaten the entire design. My daughter hisses. Bass-ackward is what the fool would call this maneuver, and he wouldn't be wrong. I'm quick at the wet bar. A dirty glass is pretty clean when you're the only one who uses it, when you enjoy the same drink every time. There's scarlet lipstick gobbed on the rim, all me. I get back in the tent before my daughter's feelings are hurt. Her light catches cut crystal in my hand, scatters blue and yellow sparks. Sherry, I say. It doesn't need to be said, but I like the word. A secretary's drink, a middle-class nightcap. She knows I'm finished forever with the red-topped bottles and the black-topped bottles, the plastic bottles with tops I lost, bottles that left clear sludge in every coffee mug in this house. My daughter beams my face like a cop. I take a sip, dainty, then lift the sheet, break the seal. I push my drink under, outside, but not away. This is me being responsible. I tuck myself in at the wrist, a cold hand out to touch the beaded glass. Just sherry. By all means, I tell her, go on. My daughter's teeth are gray with white flecks. When she tells, foam gathers in her corners, drips in ribbons under her chin. She spews. My only job is not to flinch. Flashlit, she looks nothing like me. Deep in the woods, the night is running. He will do whatever it takes to get back home. Her teeth are my fault. Weak Denton on my side of the tree. Our photo albums are full of snarled smiles, gum disease going back through the ages, white sores, and also clicky jaws, people predisposed to clench and do damage even as they slept. Plus, my daughter's precious grape soda is corrosive, I'm told. I push water and milk, but she fights me. She may not be pretty, but my girl's brain is just fine. It is. She dodged the worst genes somehow. Her father, the fool, was a man who broke the binding of the biggest ever book of party jokes, kept the glue-crusted pages paper-clipped or rubber-banded, dog-eared in his glove compartment, crammed into his blue jeans. The fool said, "What's black and white and wait, then fumbling, dull flipping. I'm not much better. At my daughter's age, I folded my failure into textbooks, blamed broken chalk for my public mistakes. Even now, I count the months on my knuckles and navigate the world by making an L out of one hand. I've got country smarts, the fool used to say, his arm deep in some majestic carcass he'd tracked for days and shot for fun. It's not the fault of the deplorable towns where the fool and I grew up, him in the bleak piney woods near the penitentiary, me up where Texas bludgeons Oklahoma, in a county known for making glue. Both of us were jaundiced preemies. Both of us were nursed on evaporated milk instead of formula, sucked on toys coated with lead paint. Whether it's nature or nurture, for people like the fool and me, there is a long beat between learning something and knowing it. For us, answers come later when we're far away from the question, if they come at all. And I'll stop there. Thank you. You go over here. Is that right? Okay. Which side do you like?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
You should ask our director of photography.
Oh, right.
Is that right?
Do I have to do anything or just?
How's this? Everyone hear us? Okay.
Is this one on? There. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for reading.
Thank
I
you.
love that story.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So there's a lot of themes in both Blacklight and We Were the Universe. Some of those are grief, motherhood, psychedelics, and of course, Texas, which we heard about in that excerpt. And I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about how you moved from the short story form to the novel. And now I guess back again.
Yeah. So I always like to think of it that for me, a short story is sort of like you're looking through a keyhole at this perfectly composed room. And the room doesn't even need you to come inside. It's perfect without you. You can just be an observer from the outside and see everything laid out as it's supposed to be. And for me, a novel is more like someone invites you into their house and they're like, hey, come in, look under the rug and you can look in that drawer and go in that room. And I haven't been in that room in forever. See what's over there. And so there's sort of advantages and disadvantages to both because I like how cool a story can be and how it can be at a little bit of a remove and how stylish it can be without being necessarily concerned about being accessible. But I feel like with a novel, you have to kind of hold your reader's hand a little bit more. You really literally have to invite them into the house. And if you don't, they get very confused about what they're allowed to do in the house or what they're not allowed to do. And then they end up just sort of walking out, back out or sitting on the floor or crying. I don't know. So you have to show them what you expect. But I feel that they're both so interesting and fun. And in some ways, I think the ideal situation is to have a really hot short story going and then have a novel that you're committed to that's been in the background for many years. And you can take little trysts with the short story and then come back to the novel because they're both such great forms to write in. But in some ways, I think the sort of tangential nature of a novel can be so fun some days. And meanwhile, other days, the tight, strict compression of the short story can be great. So yeah, I don't know. I love them both, but yeah.
Were there challenges in moving between those forms? And what did you start with for the novel and how did that change?
Yeah, so I had this idea that, my novel is about grief. And for me in my life, grief really changes the way that I experience time. There you go. Yeah.
I still got to agree.
Oh, wait, hold on. It came back. Sorry. Grief makes it so you can't exist in the present moment because everything reminds you of the person who's not with you. And so it sort of jerks you into the past. And so I wanted to write something that captured that feeling. So for a while with my novel, I had this idea that everything would be in present. I'm sorry, I can get it signed. Thank you. That everything would be in present tense. So I have a character, Kit, who's in the park with her young daughter, Gilda, and that she would suddenly be remembering her sister who she's lost. And instead of it being, I remember when Julie was 14, it would just be, Julie is 14. She has a pink backpack. It would be all present tense because that's how grief felt to me. It was that I felt like I wasn't even in either time, the present or the past. I was in some sort of liminal grief space, which sounds great, like a good idea. But my very sweet, very patient editor at one point was like, hey, so what if we tried putting the past in past tense? Might that be helpful for your reader? And I realized that that was something I could maybe have pulled off in a short story, because I think you could get it pretty quickly and know how the mind is working. But in a novel over 260 pages, it was too much. It was too hard to keep track of what was happening where. So that was one of the challenges. And the other challenge is that I'm just very allergic to these sort of basic workaday sentences, like saying, my husband, Jad, works at this, whatever. My husband, Jad, works in marketing. Like, I can't say that sentence. It kills me to say that. And you have to have sentences like that in a novel, because you have to give people little stones to step across the river. And if you don't, they just drown. And so I had to learn how to write some of those lines in a way that I could still, live with myself. But yeah. Oh, sorry. Can we switch?
Okay. Okay.
Handle back and forth. The reason we need it is for the YouTubers.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, it's not for the room.
Okay. We'll do it. We'll do it for them.
for them.
That's fine.
Any for that.
Yes. So I also wanted to ask you about place in your writing. Both Blacklight and We Are the Universe take place in Texas. We Were the Universe takes place in Pivot, which is kind of, would you say, like a cookie cutter suburb outside of Dallas, but also in the small isolated West Texas town of Wink. And they're two very different landscapes, but both Texas. So yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of place in your work, if that's part of your origin story and maybe as an element of craft.
Yeah. Yeah, so Pivot I made up because I was going to disparage it a little bit. So I took the suburb that I grew up in and changed the name a little bit. And so, but Wink is real, and I didn't disparage Wink too much. And so that's basically how, like, half the cities are fake and half are real. The towns are fake and real. I spent a lot of time as a young person trying to sort of claw my way out of Texas. I was born in Lubbock and actually spent most of my time in a town called Kittiquay, Texas, which is even smaller than Lubbock, if you can imagine. And I then ultimately ended up in a Dallas suburb, where I went to high school, and my family is all still in Texas. But I really, from the time I was very young, had this sense of elsewhere. I didn't know what it would be like. I just knew I needed to go. And so for a long time, I felt like I didn't want to write about Texas, but then it was almost like I left Texas and now I can't shut up about it. And I really started to deeply appreciate my home and where I was from after I left. And I came here to go to graduate school in 2005, and suddenly was able to, it took me a while. For a while I was writing stories about New York, like most people who move to New York write stories about New York. But it took me a while to feel comfortable writing about Texas, but now I love it so much. And I even in this new project, I'm like trying not to write. I was trying to give myself some limitations: no child's narrators, no Texas settings, and broke both of those rules almost instantly. It's just like, I can't, no gross hotel rooms. And again, a gross hotel room is right in the middle. I guess it's nice to just circle the drain. At least, you know your own stuff. I'm like, oh, there I am. Yeah. But I think I always thought of Southern writers. I was a Faulkner scholar and was writing Faulkner criticism for years, and was so aware of obviously how that played into his work. But I always felt for myself like, oh, but I'm not really from anywhere interesting, which is of course crazy. It doesn't feel interesting while you're in it sometimes, and then when you leave, you're like, these are the craziest towns ever. And also, something about that vast flat nothing of Texas is so incredibly inspiring. And at the time, I just felt desperate for a building or anything else, like a person, anybody who was more like-minded. But now when I go back, I'm like, oh, I can really appreciate it. And there's nothing like the sky. The sunsets and sunrises in Texas are out of this world. But yeah.
That's great. And I think a lot of us can probably relate to that. I come from rural Western Massachusetts and also wanted to get out and now can't shut up about it. So yeah, totally get that. So you were talking about not wanting to write a certain kind of sentence. So language is something that's clearly really important to your writing. And in interviews, I've heard you talk a bit about consecution. So I was wondering if you would tell us more about that and your process with language and sentences.
Sure. So I think the sort of the best place to start with consecution is with Gariel Lutz's talk, "The Sentence is a Lonely Place," which was printed in an issue of The Believer magazine. But I saw this talk live at Columbia in 2007 or 8. And essentially what Gariel was talking about was how it was this principle that was introduced by Gordon Lish, but it's something that every good writer is already doing naturally, which is that you're looking at the sentence that you've just written to show you how to write the next sentence. And everyone who's doing this well at all is already doing it. And some people are naturally just really attuned to sonics and the way sounds work in sentences. But so all of my favorite writers were doing this, but then when I found this, person who was explicitly talking about it, I got really excited because I had sensed all of my favorite writers, Amy Hempel, Christine Scutt, Barry Hannah, Dennis Johnson, Sam Lipsyte, they were all doing this anyway, but they were also studying with Gordon Lish. And so then I was like, well, I'm going to go study with Gordon Lish. And so I did. And it was great and really eye-opening. And I think it's just this idea of pulling what is profitable from the sentence that came before to inform the way you move forward. And so that could be that it's a sound. In the case of someone like Sam Lipsyte, there's a lot of acoustic consecution where it's just there's a line that's like undercooked carrot soup or something. And you're like, of course it's undercooked carrot. Like it's that hard C in the middle of those words. But then in the next sentence, there would be another hard C, and you can sort of trace these things all the way through. And what I love about consecution is that anytime you sit down to write, it doesn't feel like I have to look and reach for something that's ahead of me. All I have to do is look at what I've already said. And it's more to me like stringing beads on a necklace than, say, I don't know, this rising action, falling action bullshit that they make you learn. It's much more like this idea of this sort of recurring and recursive language, sounds, even themes too, where it's like maybe there's a character who, this is a really simplified version, but if there's a character who breaks a window in the first chapter, then maybe something else gets broken. It's just tracing those things through so that everything is, as Lish would say, in the case, where there's a reason, even if it feels surprising sometimes. I got to break a window. I got to break something else. There's something broken, or I have to use this same S sound because I used it in 3 places on this other page. But for me, it's like, it's almost, I don't write with an outline. I don't ever plan anything out in advance. If I have an idea about something, that's exactly how I know it's never going to work. Anytime I've ever had an idea, it's been the worst thing ever. I don't outline, I don't plan. I want to be surprised, but I also want to get into this really deep meditative state of listening. And so consecution is great for someone like me because I can just look back just the sentence before and know exactly where to pick up. And it's just, again, stringing beads on a necklace until you have a long ass weird necklace and then trying to figure out what you're going to do with it. Yeah.
I love that. A follow-up question. If that's a process that some of us also sort of have, what do you see are the challenges when you have, say, a deadline, or someone's asking for, say, an outline, or something like that? How do you approach those challenges?
So the outline you can just make up. You just lie, and it just changes later, and then later you're like, I don't know. I've done that before. The thing about consecution is some people talk about how it makes things slower, but to me it makes things faster because I don't have that sense of like, what am I going to write today? It's just literally I'm writing the T sound right now, this second, and now that's going to inform how things are moving. And then of course all of this other stuff comes from this place of deep knowing about characters that you are too dumb as a writer to know, and you should be. You want to stay dumb as long as possible. But your body knows something underneath that's happening with those characters. So I'm worried about the T sound, but meanwhile, there's something happening at this like character level. Whereas if I tried to do that from the top down, it never works for me. It always becomes this weird shoehorning way of mashing characters into doing them what I want them to do. Whereas if I'm really focused on the micro, then the macro can sort of come about. But for me, it's actually faster to use consecution than to try to like, what do people do? Make stuff up? Are you just like, what should I have the character do today? Like that seems so hard and scary to me. It's so much better to me to be tethered to some sort of little thread that I can pull. But I think also the story that it takes a long time to write is also often a story that you're telling yourself. And sometimes it's not serving you, and it's good to let go of those stories. Robert and I were talking about this, like, oh, it takes, this idea of it takes many years to write a novel. It actually doesn't. Well, so we were talking about screenwriting. Screenwriting is supposed to be fast, right? We just know it takes 90 days to write a screenplay. If we thought it took 90 days to write a novel, I bet a lot of us would write novels faster. I think there's a sort of mythos attached to the length of time it takes to finish something. And sometimes that's great. And of course it does take as long as it takes. And I took 12 years to write this book. So but that's because I was learning as I was doing it. But I do think that sometimes you have to say, hey, is that story that I'm telling myself that I'm slow? Is that really true? Or is that something that's just, is it an excuse, or is it something I've just been saying for so long? And is that story serving me anymore? Or can I say, hey, I have 2 years to write this book under contract, so I'm just going to do it because I need the money or whatever, because I'm ready to get paid again. And I think that can be, I think there's a lot of things in the writing world, like writer's block in general, but also like the idea that it takes 10 years to write a masterpiece. I kind of almost start to feel that when people are inching past certain year marks, I'm like, what are you doing exactly? Like it starts to be like, are you spinning wheels, or are you actually, it's good to check in with yourself. I'm saying this for myself too, by the way, always. Everything I say is also directed to me. So yes.
Yeah, that's all very, I think, relatable. And yeah, great advice for all of us. You mentioned characters and not shoehorning them forcing them into the plot. In both of your books, I would say there's a cast of very flawed but empathetic characters, like the mother in Foxes. She's in this tent and her daughter is telling a story. Meanwhile, the mother is sort of somewhat trying to hide that she's drinking. We also have kids who want to put a fiddleback or a black widow spider in a neighbor's mailbox. We have even an abusive boyfriend point of view at one point. So I was wondering, how do these characters come to you? And what's important about writing those very flawed, but also empathetic characters? How do you balance that? Yeah.
I forgot about those kids and that spider. That's true. I'm always thinking about ways. I never want, as a reader, to see my own morals reflected back at me on the page. I find it really boring. I am looking for ways as a reader to feel in like really intense empathy. And so the way that I do that is by showing characters that I honestly, half the characters that I write that people are like, they're so flawed. I'm like, that was just my neighbor, or like, that's my family member, I'm trying to write real people that are making, trying and failing and making mistakes, because I also find it to be really relatable. I also like characters who believe, this is a Sam Lipsyte thing, even if everybody else in the novel thinks that character is fine, that character has to believe that they're the shittiest character in the book, which saves a lot, right? Because people who write characters where the main character is somehow the best character, this is a problem. It's a big problem. And again, like I don't read fiction to see good people making great decisions. I don't find that to be interesting at all. And not to say that you have to write the most shock value stuff, or that Dennis Johnson's Jesus Son is for everyone. It's certainly for me. But some people are going to say, oh, it's too much, or it's too dark, or whatever. I think that when you write into whatever it is, that is the thing that lights you up the most, you're going to find your authentic reader. And for me, it's writing these characters who are big-hearted screw-ups, and they're trying, but they're often failing. Yeah.
And you also mentioned that you have this affinity for the first person and the present tense. So I was wondering, what is it about that draws you in?
Yeah. I think, it's all it's all a pose, the whole thing, right? A third person, first person. To me, third person, I love third person present tense. That's creepy. But third person to me feels, I'm like, who's talking? There's always this part of me that's like, is it God? Is it the writer? And I feel it's harder for me to lose myself reading third person. And everything that I do comes from a place of readership. And it's just wanting to write the things that I would really want to read. And so that one feels less false to me, or less like a pose, writing from first person present tense. I know it's not for everyone, but it is so for me. And when I read it and I think about, Amy Hempel, and I start to read that first person present tense, it's like, we know that there's no possible way it could ever be first person present tense, because they're doing things as they're writing them. Like, it's such a weird thing if you start to think about it. But I love the immediacy and the urgency that comes from first person present tense. It reminds me of the way that people talk about dreams. I'm walking down the hall and I see this clown, like whatever. And there's something about that is compelling to me. Whereas when I hear like she's walking down the hall, a little more interesting, but she walked down the hall, I just have this sense of like, who is telling me this and why are they telling me this? And it's harder for me to lose myself. Not to say that you can't do it. And in Blacklight, the last story, Starlight, is a third person story. That's because the main character is so screwed up and believes she's having so much fun. And we need to see her from the outside to see that she absolutely is not having fun. And so that was what I was playing with there. But I think for the most part, my instinct is still first person. And if I can swing it first person present tense, knowing also that you're going to have, with every aesthetic decision we make, we choose our readers and we also repel people. And that's great, because we want to let the people in who are the right people. And then for the others, we want them to get out quickly. Go. Like, let's save each other a bunch of time. I think there was when I was a younger writer, I would always sort of work up to things in stories, or I would save things for halfway or many pages in. And now I'm like, no, from page one, we say, this is who this character is. And if you're not on board, you should go, and we'll, leave the door open for the person who wants to come in.
I have tons of questions. So I just want to throw it to Robert for a time check. How we doing?
We're doing okay.
Okay, good. You'll let me know.
I will.
Okay, because I'll just keep going. Perfect. Okay. So something else that really struck me about We Were the Universe is, of course, the theme of grief. There's a line at one point that no family lasts forever, that really just sort of knocked me on the floor. And there's also so much humor in the book as well that I think plays a really important role together with grief. So I was wondering if you might talk a bit about what it was like writing about grief, what challenges there were, what discoveries you may have made.
Yeah, I think I really wanted to write a book about grief, but I didn't want it to be such a downer. I wanted it to be, I mean, and also there's like this whole thread of fantasy that she's engaging into in the book. So it was like this idea of where sex meets death, meets humor, meets, life meets death everywhere. And so it was really my intention I actually didn't set out to write a book about grief at all. But I was coming to terms with some things from my personal life around the time when I was writing it. And it was like, when things start to fall into the book, just listen to that. I think you just trust it. It's like, I don't know if I keep writing about this, maybe that's what I need to be writing right now. And so real life was informing what was happening in the book. But then the humor piece has just always been that my favorite people ever are people who can make me laugh. And also, no matter how beautiful a book is, if it's not funny, it's missing something for me. And if there's not, even if it's like just self-deprecation or something, if there's got to be some thread of, it can be Black humor, but it has to be something funny. Or it's interesting because even really gorgeous books, when I put it down, I'm like, but it wasn't funny. There wasn't any humor there. I need both parts. And I think it's just a real, it's part of resilience. And I think when you're trying to balance the dark themes or the, the bleakness of losing a sibling, it's like it can help to have these moments of levity, but also just anytime we're attuned. The thing about funny people is that they're paying attention and they're listening to what's just been said, and they're looking at frames of reference and they're present. And what I want to feel as a reader is that the writer is present, but also that the characters are present, and having humor on the page, but having humor in real life too. It means you have to be responding in real time to things that are happening around you and paying attention. And so, yeah, I feel like you can do beauty from a distance and from far away, alone in your room, but humor is like in the moment. You got to be quick. That's why I like it.
Yeah, and I think there's also one of my favorite lines is said by the water witch.
Yes.
In We Were the Universe, when she says, I was perfect and then I was born.
Yeah.
And it's that and then, which is both tragic and comic.
Yeah.
If it was, I was perfect, but like, and I was born, it would be different. It's the and then.
Yeah.
It's lovely. But yeah, and I think along with humor, I think you're also sort of upsetting certain expectations. Like it's kind of a minor character, but Yesenia, the friend who is back at home in Texas, still in Wink. She was part of the band that Kit, the main character, and her sister Julie were in high school. She's kind of has this story that you would expect to go wrong. She has kids really young and stays at home, but she's like the most stable person maybe in the book. And we also have Kit coming out to her sister when she's young, and in Texas, would maybe be a fraught situation, but it really isn't. So I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about like what expectations you were sort of working against in the novel.
Yeah, I think that with the expectation, well, this also goes back to the empathy piece. I think when you are entering into a space of radical empathy for your characters, you are no longer judgmental of those characters, but also you can see that Yesenia, who's this very sort of traditional, she has a bunch of kids and she stayed in the small town, and she's just as happy as Kit, who also is pretty unhappy, but she actually is happy. And her life it would be deemed sort of small perhaps by someone else, but our narrator Kit doesn't think that. She's like, no, she's got a great life. She has it together. They just have wanted different things. I think there's that feeling, when you're like an undergrad and you realize, oh wait, the American dream is different for every single person. Like everybody has a different thing that they want, and nothing is better or worse, or if someone has a different life than me. And I think in my case too, I'm often writing characters who are closed-minded because this is what I grew up with, and they may be closed-minded characters, but they are still full, complete, whole characters who have just as much of an interior life as anyone else. And even if whatever, we can talk about politics or whatever, but growing up in a place like that, you realize, well, there are 1,000 things that we can't talk about. And there's one thing that we can, and I'm going to find the one thing that we can, and I'm going to meet this person where they are because they're a human child of God, and I'm going to meet them there, even if, it's very difficult to do so. And I think that, and not to say that all of these characters are like that, that's sort of elevated in that way, but I just am always thinking of how can you write characters who are living the life that they want to live, and even if that's not the same thing that everyone else would want, that's just for them. And yeah, so I think it still goes back to this idea of that empathy piece, which is also writing what I've heard are despicable characters, which I put in quotes because I'm like, wait, who? Which one did you think was, oh, okay. And then I'm like, they're like, which character are you the closest to? I'm like, well, now I'm not going to say because you've just said that. Or like, difficult characters or something where I'm like, oh, they seemed pretty easy to me, but yeah.
Yeah, I feel like these characters are, also us.
Yeah.
So, yeah. That's the signal. Take it to the room. Okay. I still have more questions if you guys don't, but please. Who wants to?
Okay. Hi, I'm Allie. I just want to, maybe this is too much information, but I went on a date last night and she was like, why are you into me? And I was like, because you're funny. And she actually thought that was a compliment, which I thought that was a good sign. So anyway, I get that. So yeah, I had a question about fiction just versus nonfiction. I'm in a nonfiction class right now with Robert, and it's kind of a hard task, I think, sometimes to like capture the magic of fiction in a nonfiction piece, like craft wise. And I just was curious, like what draws you to fiction specifically, and if you ever kind of felt like trying nonfiction and what that was like.
So I will say this, I was asked to write an essay, and the sentence needed a different sound for the kind of car that my mom drives. And so it needed to be a Datsun, right? It was not a Datsun, but I made it a Datsun. And I don't know, is that allowed? I know that but this happens to me constantly when I'm trying to write nonfiction, where I'm like, well, I have to actually bend the truth to get the sound I'm looking for here, because I'm worried mostly about sound. But I also think that for me, the same principles apply as a reader anyway. I think I'm looking for the same thing in both. I'm looking for this. I'm still looking for sentence level stuff, obviously. And I'm still looking for that sort of, the interior life of a character. I often, when I work with students and they're writing nonfiction, I always refer to the character as the narrator. And I'm like, I could just say you, but it's not you, because it's at a remove. It is now, anytime we commit like pen to paper, fingers to the keyboard, it's different. It's no longer reality anyway. So I feel like it still applies to the same rules apply. And that's that. All of that stuff still matters. Sounds still matter, and acoustics matter, and sentences matter, and maybe it's that you have to sometimes bend chronology. Maybe that is an answer that I'm actually writing something for a magazine right now, and they were like, he's like, this is great. He was doing a vibe check, which is probably smart of him. And he was like, this seems like this is like the middle to the end of the essay, but it's the very first part. So can you like fluff it up? Like, we need some fluffy stuff before we get here. And I was just like, oh man, I guess I could do that. And then I started to think like, I can do that before we just immediately jump into this, like, big problematic scene. I was like, sure, I can do that. It's a travel magazine. So I'm like, right. But I think it's just about maybe balancing those things and figuring out, what can I do with time? You get to do the same thing. You get to manipulate time. You get to manipulate, character to an extent, narrative. Yeah, it's all the same. But I definitely think that when I'm tasked with writing real things, I sometimes am like, well, I'm going to have to lie here. And I don't know how much of that is allowed or not allowed, but I'm lying for a specific purpose, because I need it to happen in this way, to serve the better purpose of the story, to actually get to the truth, which is, this is not what happened. But if I tell you it this way, you will get a deeper sense of the truth. Makes sense, which I don't know. I feel like that's what you guys are working with all the time, probably, is that very conundrum. So yeah, thank you though.
Hi. My question, so thinking about sound, writing like from the sentence level, I feel like, that's also like naturally the way that I approach writing. But then what trips me up later is trying to figure out if things are in the right order, if it's in the right form, maybe. And I was wondering, maybe if you could speak to that, because you're writing something, if you're stringing it along in this way, it feels like it's almost stuck that way. And when, like, maybe it's not the best form or order of the story, like, how do you detangle it and sort of move it around, sort of in the revision process, maybe? Yeah.
Yeah. So my friend who's in my writing group, Mitchell Jackson, he talks about it. We were both in the Lish class and both write with consecution, but it's like you get these chunks, these like blocks, right? And the block is kind of set, because if you start pulling things out, it's going to collapse, right? So you have these sections that are almost like modules that you can move around. But I also think that for me, writing with consecution is the way to generate the work. And then you got to shake that shit out. Like, then it's done. And now you look at it and you go, oh, well, I can't just keep it all locked together like this. Now it's like a weird Dr. Seuss thing. Like, now I have to go through and add some sentences that aren't so like maybe that are in the same sound range or something like that. Like I go through and just shake it out so that anything that feels false or sounds strange leaves. And maybe that is replaced with something that's a more workaday sentence. Or you're like, just have her open the window and just say, you know, I opened the window and move on from there. But I think that for me, consecution is really critical in the writing process. But in revision, it's something else. And revision, it's like where you're now looking at the thing you made and saying, does this now sound bizarre? Like, is this weird? Does it work anymore? But I also think of like some of those sections, if you started moving lines around, they would just fall apart, right? Because everything is so dependent on what came before. But then that's fine. Keep that section there. And then probably what will happen, which is what I had to do a lot with my editor, is there are all these places where they want you to expand and there are sort of cracks. And anywhere where you see light coming through, you're like, okay, this is a place where I need to now write something else. And then maybe it's like, it's not even using consecution anymore at all in those sections, so that there's this sense of like, that it's more natural and less about artifice, if that makes sense. So yeah, for me, it's really about the generating it first, but then later you can mess it up. Yeah. Thanks.
Chad was next, and then I think.
Yeah, we Chad and then Meryl, and then we move on with the line.
Okay. Allie said her name and Rachel didn't, so now I don't know if I should say my name or not. Okay. I'm Chad. You spoke very eloquently about not being able to write about Texas, not being able to write about where you're from, and Erin said she relates to that. I also relate to that. What was the thing that helped you get there? Start writing about where you're from?
I think it was distance, like literal physical distance, and time, and just being away from it for a while. I think also realizing that we all have a natural tendency to think that our own childhoods are not interesting, or that my friend who is an amazing writer, he grew up in like suburban Minnesota and Minneapolis, and he's like, there's nothing interesting about suburban Minneapolis. And then when he starts getting into it, I'm like, this is amazing. Everyone's childhood is amazing. Everyone has their weird particular things, often tied to place, or tied to a certain person who lives in that place. So I think it's just maybe getting the space and distance to do it. I think I was also just really concerned about like, oh, am I a Southern? Texas isn't even the South. It's like its own weird country. But like, am I, if I enter into this place, is that going to make me do I have to write about this? If I suddenly, now I'm going to be like a Texas writer. But the truth is just that all you can do is write about the stuff that you really want to write about. And I think to just remember that every place, like every single place, my friend, Mike Nagel writes about suburban Dallas. Like he talks about which Starbucks is the best Starbucks and like why one Target is a bad Target. And I'm like, but it's so funny and so good. And if you had told me before you need to write about this particular suburb, I would be like, what is there to say? What could there possibly be? And that's just an excuse. Like good writers can write about anything. But yeah, I think it's just getting the time and distance, maybe.
Hey, I'm Meryl, and I just finished reading your book this morning. Oh, nice. Thank you. So I was wondering a little bit about the dual timeline, and if you were often like writing the scenes like at the same time, or if you figured that all out later. Yeah. Thank you for having a really. All of that. Let's see.
Sorry, YouTube. Oh, no, there it goes. Okay. I wrote them separately, and I wrote them. So I had the past actually first, and the past was written start to finish first. And then I had the present. And then when I was in revisions, then there would be certain moments where they would be like, what if there's a scene? My editor might ask me something or say like, sometimes an editor is just someone who's asking you the questions that you were just avoiding already purposefully. But she's like, why didn't we see this one thing? And I'm like, because I didn't want to write it, but okay. But yeah, so I definitely like sort of thought of them where if you pulled those things apart, they would work almost without the other component. Like that's sort of the goal. And I often tell students to do that too. Like if you can pull out all the scenes, pull out your present plane, pull out your past and look at them and see how it works. And not to say that they have to have equal weight, like it's emotional chronology, right? So it's not about like for every scene in the past is a scene in the present, but it's just that that story has to feel full and like its own totality. Like each section has to feel like that. And then they just sort of mesh together. And then sometimes the tricky part is actually figuring out when to mesh them together. And I wrote this psychedelic trip that happens in the middle of my book. I wrote that at the exact same time. Well, the exact same time. I wrote that the same period of time that I wrote the ending. And those two scenes are resonant with each other. And so they needed to connect, but they're from different perspectives without giving anything away. I love how like in literary fiction, you can't ruin the plot because there's just not really much of a plot. So no spoilers because there aren't any. But I wrote it from a different perspective. Right after I finished writing the scene from one perspective, I wrote it from a different perspective. And then I knew right away that that was the ending. So yeah, thank you.
Great, let's all be.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for having me. Thanks for the wonderful question. Appreciate it. Oh, thank you so much for being here. And thank you to my son for sitting through that. He's like, how long will it be? I was like, 15 minutes.